My phone buzzed on the countertop at 11 o'clock at night, the screen lighting up with a picture of my son's family, all beaming at a promotion party I hadn't been invited to. And then, the text from my daughter-in-law popped up beneath it. "Anne, make sure you heat up the leftover prime rib in the fridge. Don't let it go to waste." My name is Anne Harrison. I'm a 72-year-old widow from Charlotte, North Carolina, and that message, well, that was the final straw. They thought I'd just quietly do as I was told, but what they didn't know was that they had just handed me the reason to start a war I'd been quietly preparing for a long, long time. If this story about reclaiming one's dignity touches your heart, please give it a thumbs up and pass it along. F-Times, allow the channel and leave your thoughts below. Tell me your story or what you think of this one, because no woman ever deserves to become invisible. The October dawn in Charlotte, North Carolina has a certain gentle, melancholy beauty to it. The pale yellow light filters through the maple trees just beginning to turn, casting long stripes of sun across the gleaming oak floors of the large kitchen. I've always woken up at 5 in the morning. It's a habit that's bone deep, formed over 45 years of marriage to my late husband, Richard. He was an early riser, and I loved sharing the stillness of the morning with him when the rest of the world felt like it was still fast asleep. But Richard has been gone for 4 years now. These days, I wake up not out of old habit but for new duties. The quiet of the early morning is no longer my own. It's just the brief pause before I start orchestrating the lives of others. This house is beautiful, there's no denying it. It's in Ballantyne, a ritzy suburb where the lawns are perfectly manicured and luxury cars sit neatly in front of 3-car garages. It has 5 bedrooms, a modern kitchen with cold marble countertops, and a spacious backyard where my 2 grandchildren, Olivia and Leo, often play. It is the dream house of my son, Scott, and my daughter-in-law, Jessica. And me? I was just a ghost living in their dream. The hiss of the coffee machine broke the silence. I was making 2 kinds, 1 pot for Scott, with 2 spoonfuls of sugar and a splash of heavy cream, just the way Jessica had trained him. The other was black, no sugar, for Jessica. She said it helped her stay sharp for her job at the bank. I've never seen her drink coffee any other way, just as I've never seen her show an emotion other than cool control. I moved around the kitchen like a seasoned pro. Everything had its place, not my place, but Jessica's. The plates had to be stacked by size. The mugs had to have their handles facing the same direction. I once put a mug in the wrong way, and that evening, Jessica had said gently but with a clear undertone during dinner, "Mother Ann, I think we should agree on a system for organizing things. A tidy space makes for a tidy mind." I was 72 years old. I had managed a household and the books for a small company for 30 years. I knew what it meant to be organized, but I just nodded and said, "Of course, dear." That had been my answer to almost everything for the past 3 years. "Of course, dear." I pulled the bread from the oven. The smell of butter and yeast filled the room. I made garlic toast for Scott, his favorite since he was a little boy. For 10-year-old Olivia, I carefully cut the crusts off her sandwich, spreading a thin layer of strawberry jam and peanut butter. She hated the crusts. For 7-year-old Leo, I prepared a bowl of Greek yogurt with a few raspberries and a homemade banana muffin. He was a picky eater, but he would never turn down his grandma's muffins. My love for them was measured in these small details, the kind of things their parents were too busy to notice. "Grandma, that smells so good!" Leo ran into the kitchen, his blonde hair a mess and his eyes still sleepy. He wrapped his arms around my legs. I bent down, kissed the top of his head, and felt a familiar warmth spread through my chest. This was why. This was the reason I put up with it all. "A banana muffin for my little champion," I said, placing one in his hand. Olivia followed, already dressed neatly in her school uniform. "Good morning, Grandma," she said, sitting at the table, poised and much older than her years. At 7 o'clock, Scott and Jessica came downstairs. Scott, my son, the 2-year-old man in whom I still saw the shadow of a little boy with tow-headed hair. He wore a crisp white shirt that I had ironed for him the night before. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, kids," he said, his voice a bit tired. He gave me a quick, almost reflexive peck on the cheek, then sat down. Jessica was different. She was like a cold breeze sweeping through. Today she wore a tailored navy blue suit, her brown hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Her Chanel No. 5 perfume overpowered the smell of baked goods. She didn't say hello, just scanned the kitchen with a quick, appraising glance. Her long fingers, tipped with nude acrylic nails, slid across the marble countertop. I knew she was checking for dust. "Anne," she began, without looking at me. "Next time, please use the organic olive oil I bought. This brand isn't good for the children's health." She pointed to the bottle I was using to fry the eggs. It was a normal bottle of oil, the kind I'd used my whole life. Her bottle, imported from Italy, cost $30. "Of course, dear," I replied, my voice even, as I flipped an egg in the pan. I felt Scott's eyes on me for a second, a fleeting glance filled with discomfort, before he quickly looked back down at his phone. He always chose that path, avoidance. Breakfast passed in a tense silence, broken only by the chatter of the children. Jessica checked emails on her tablet. Scott read the news. I stood by the stove, cleaning up, feeling like a servant in the production of my own family's life. And then, Jessica's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and for the first time that morning, a real emotion crossed her face. A radiant smile. "Excuse me, I have to take this," she said, standing up and walking into the living room. We could hear her voice, professional at first, then growing with excitement. "Really? Oh my God. Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson. I won't let you down." Jessica walked back into the dining room, her face flushed with joy. She looked like a completely different person. "I got it!" she squealed at Scott. "They chose me, vice president. I've been promoted to vice president." Scott leaped from his chair, forgetting his phone and his coffee. He swept Jessica up in a hug, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. "I knew it. I knew you could do it, honey." The children cheered along, even though they didn't really understand what was happening. "Is Mommy a big boss now?" Leo asked. "That's right, sweetie. Your mom is a very big boss." Jessica laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh. In that brief moment, she looked beautiful and happy. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the spatula still in my hand. I smiled too. "Congratulations, Jessica. That's wonderful news." She turned to me, her smile dimming just a little, as if she had just remembered I was there. "Thank you, Anne." And then she turned back to Scott, the excitement rushing back. "Tonight, we have to celebrate big tonight. Scott, book a table at the Capitol Grill. A table for 4. 4 people." The words echoed in my head like a death knell. 4 people. Scott, Jessica, Olivia, Leo. My heart clenched, a familiar sharp ache I'd tried to numb over the last 3 years. I had held on to a foolish, fragile hope that in a moment of joy like this, I might be included as part of the we. But no, I was just Anne, the invisible help. I turned my back to them, pretending to be busy at the sink. I heard Scott say, "Okay, I'll call right now." I waited. I waited for him to say something more. Something like, "How about a table for 5, honey?" Or, "What about Mom?" But there was nothing, just the sound of him pulling out his phone and making the reservation. The rest of that day passed in a blur. After Scott and Jessica dropped the kids at school and left for work, the house became frighteningly quiet. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a deep, empty void that swallowed me whole. I cleaned up the remnants of breakfast, wiped up coffee spills, and straightened the chairs. I went through the rooms, vacuuming the expensive Persian rug in the living room, wiping down the large windows that looked out onto the perfectly kept garden. Everything was sparkling, clean, and alien. This was their house, bought with my money, but I didn't belong here. I remembered the day I sold my and Richard's home, the little house in our old neighborhood where we had raised Scott, where every scratch on the floor told a story. I sold it for $450,000. A week later, Scott and Jessica came to see me. They wanted to buy a bigger house, but their credit history wasn't great. They needed $90,000 for a down payment. "Come live with us, Mom," Scott had said, taking my hand. "We'll be a family again. You won't have to be alone, and you can help us with the kids. It's the perfect solution for everyone." Jessica had smiled and nodded. "Yes, Mother Ann. The children just adore you. It would be wonderful to have you with us." I had believed them. I had been so hungry for a family that I was blind to all the warning signs. I gave them the $90,000, and I moved into their dream. In the afternoon, I made myself an early dinner. I didn't want to see them all dressed up to go out without me. I heated up a can of thin tomato soup, the cheap kind. I ate alone in the vast kitchen, at the small breakfast nook in the corner, not the elegant mahogany dining table that seated 10. The help doesn't eat at the master's table. At 5 o'clock they came home. The house was suddenly filled with noise and energy. Jessica had bought a new dress, a vibrant red one she called her power color. Scott was whistling happily. The kids were excited to be going to a grown-up restaurant. No one spoke to me. I was like a piece of furniture, present but unseen. As they were about to leave, Scott came over to me. "You have a good night, Mom. We'll be back late." He gave me another quick peck on the cheek. "Don't wait up. You all have a wonderful time," I said, forcing a smile. The door closed behind them, taking all the laughter and life with it. Silence fell over me again, heavier this time. I cleaned up the things they'd left strewn about the empty dress box, Jessica's old high heels. I went up to my room and tried to read a book, but not a single word registered. I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the clock, counting the minutes as they crawled by. 11 o'clock. I was in the kitchen, about to get a glass of warm water before bed. I was tired, not from physical work, but from emotional exhaustion. And then, my phone on the counter buzzed. A tiny, stupid flicker of hope ignited in me. Maybe it was Scott. Maybe they were on their way home and wanted to know if I wanted anything. I picked up the phone. The screen lit up. It was a message from Jessica. Beneath her name was a picture. A photo of the four of them, beaming beside a massive seafood tower at the Capitol Grill. Jessica looked stunning in her red dress. Scott looked so proud. Olivia and Leo were playfully poking at the lobsters. They looked like a picture-perfect family from a magazine cover. And then, I read the text beneath the photo. "Anne, remember to heat up the leftover prime rib in the fridge for your lunch tomorrow. Don't let it go to waste." I read it once. I read it a second time. And a third. Something inside of me, something I had been trying to hold together, to protect for 3 long years, finally broke. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was more like the sound of a small pebble hitting a pane of glass at first, just a tiny crack, and from there, the fissures begin to spread, silent and unstoppable, until the whole thing shatters into 1,000 tiny pieces. There were no tears. The rage I expected to feel never came. Instead, a kind of ice-cold calm washed over me. It was as if my body knew what to do long before my mind could catch up. I didn't reply to the text. I just deleted it, silently erasing the final piece of evidence of their humiliation. I set the phone down on the table, as gently as if it were a piece of fine china. I stood up, my back straight. Every movement I made was slow and deliberate. I walked upstairs, not making a sound. I went into my bedroom, the smallest room in the house, overlooking the backyard. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection. I saw a 72-year-old woman with silver hair and the lines of a life fully lived. But tonight, I didn't see a tired old woman, a forgotten mother, or an invisible housekeeper. Tonight, in the eyes of the woman in the mirror, I saw a fire that had just been rekindled from the embers, a cold, bright, and determined fire. They thought they had pushed me to my breaking point. They had no idea they had just pushed me to the starting line of a plan I had been quietly preparing for the last 6 months. Tonight, I would not be heating up their leftovers. Tonight, I was going to disappear, and when they came home, what they would find wouldn't be the silence of an empty house, but the collapse of the entire world they had built on my sacrifice. The calm that settled over me wasn't the emptiness of despair. It was the sharp-edged stillness that comes when you've found your purpose. For 3 years, I had been adrift in an ocean of tolerance, pushed around by the invisible waves of disrespect and the cold winds of neglect. But Jessica's text, that cruel and arrogant message, it wasn't the final wave that drowned me. It was the unexpected lighthouse, suddenly blazing to life, showing me the way to shore. And that shore wasn't a safe harbor. It was a battleground. I didn't waste another second mourning the woman who had lived in this house. That woman was gone. She died on that cold kitchen floor the moment she read that text message. The person walking up the stairs now was someone else. She was Anne Harrison, a widow, a mother, and most importantly, a former bookkeeper. And if there is one thing a good bookkeeper does best, it's balancing the books. All of them. My bedroom, the smallest of the 5, was always kept neat. Jessica liked that. She called it respecting the shared space. I called it being prepared. Under my bed, covered by an old wool blanket, was a navy blue travel suitcase. It wasn't dusty because I pulled it out to wipe it clean every week. Inside, there were no clothes. Inside was my arsenal. I knelt on the cold hardwood floor and pulled the suitcase out. The whir of the wheels on the wood was the only sound in the room. I unlocked it. The click of the 2 latches sounded like a rifle being loaded. Inside, arranged methodically, was my forgotten life. But more importantly, it was the evidence of their crime. A crime not written in any law book, but etched into the heart of every mother. The crime of ingratitude. The first thing I took out was a black leather-bound ledger, the kind accountants used to use back in the day. On the first page, in my careful handwriting, I had written, "The Harrison family ledger commenced August 15, 2022. That was the day I gave Scott the $90,000 check." Inside this book were more than just numbers. Next to each expense, I had noted the context. The 15th of August 2022, $90,000. Down payment for the house at 1245 Providence Road. Scott said, "This will be our home, Mom, ours." The 2nd of September 2022, $4,800. Living room sofa set. Jessica said, "My old sofa didn't fit the modern aesthetic of the house. I paid with my credit card." The 17th of October 2022, $52,450. A short-term loan for Jessica to invest in a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She promised to pay it back in 6 months with interest. It has been 2.5 years. Page after page, it was a detailed chronicle of financial exploitation disguised as family affection. Every bill, every receipt, every bank statement was carefully clipped to its corresponding page. The grand total was over $140,000. But this ledger was more than financial proof. It was a journal of my pain. Beneath the ledger was a smaller box. I opened it. Inside was a digital voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. I'd bought it at an electronics store 6 months ago. I had felt guilty doing it, like a spy in my own home. But Scott's silence had forced my hand. He wouldn't protect me, so I had to find a way to protect myself. I didn't even have to try hard. When you're invisible, people talk in front of you as if you aren't there. I just had to turn on the recorder in my apron pocket while I was cooking or cleaning. I had 17 recordings, 17 silver bullets. Jessica's voice, laughing on the phone with her friend. That old woman? Having her here is like having a free maid. Cooks, cleans, babysits. And it doesn't cost a dime. Jessica's voice, arguing with Scott. Your mother is spoiling the children. They're going to love her more than me. We have to find a way to limit her influence. And the worst one, her voice, whispering to her sister. The minute she starts getting senile or sick, we'll stick her in a cheap nursing home. The house legally is already ours. Finally, at the very bottom of the suitcase was a file folder wrapped in clear plastic. It was the original deed to this house, the house at 1245 Providence Road. Under the section marked Owner, there was only one name, printed in crisp, clear letters, Ann Harrison. I hadn't deceived them. They had deceived themselves. When we bought the house, the lawyer had suggested my name be the only one on the deed, since the down payment was mine and my credit was spotless. It's just safer for you this way, Mrs. Harrison, he'd said. You can always transfer the title to your son later. Scott and Jessica had happily agreed, eager to just move in. For the first few months, Scott brought it up a couple of times. Mom, let's get that paperwork done this weekend. But there was always an excuse. Jessica was busy, the kids were sick. And then, he just stopped asking. And I never brought it up again. A part of me, the survival instinct of a woman who has lived long enough to know you can't always trust a promise, kept quiet. That silence was now my fortress. I carefully placed all of these items into a leather briefcase Richard had given me. My arsenal was ready. Now, it was time to pack my life. I opened the closet. My clothes took up just a small corner. I took only the essentials. A few everyday outfits, my favorite warm sweater, the one silk nightgown I had bought for myself last Christmas. I didn't take the items Jessica had bought me for birthdays or Mother's Day gifts chosen in a hurry, without a thought, just to fulfill an obligation. They belonged to her world, not mine. I walked to my dresser. There sat a silver picture frame, the last photo of me and Richard, taken on our 40th wedding anniversary trip. In it, he has his arm around me, and we are both smiling, the kind of smile from people who have weathered storms together and found their peace. I was going to leave it, but then I thought, no, I will not leave Richard in this place. He doesn't belong in a house so lacking in love. I gently placed the frame between the soft folds of a sweater in my suitcase. And then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I took off my wedding ring, the one that hadn't left my finger since the day Richard put it there. I set it on the table. Then I put on my engagement ring, the ring of Anne Harrison, not Richard's wife, not Scott's mother. Just Anne. After a moment, I put the wedding band back on too. I was all of them, and it was time for all of them to fight together. The suitcase was packed. I rolled it to the door, quietly, soundlessly. It was time to make the calls. I didn't sit down. I stood straight, looking out the window at the sleeping city. I opened my old laptop. I went to my email and composed a new message. To Akin@shenandassociates.com. Subject: The Harrison Plan. The body of the email contained only 4 words. Alex, it's time. Begin. Alex Chen was the son of an old friend, a young lawyer, sharp and ambitious. I had gone to see him 6 months ago. He was shocked by my story, but his professionalism quickly took over. He helped me map out every step of this plan, a flawless legal assault with no loopholes. This email was our pre-arranged signal. It would trigger a series of legal actions at precisely 9 a.m. I hit send and closed the laptop. Next, I picked up my cell phone. I scrolled through my contacts, past Scott without pausing. I pressed on the name Brenda. Brenda has been my best friend for 40 years. Our husbands were colleagues. We raised our children together. We saw each other through life's highs and lows. She knew. She didn't know the full details of the plan, but she knew my pain. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice thick with sleep. Anne? What's wrong? It's almost 1 a.m. Brenda, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm coming over to stay for a few days. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brenda knew me well enough to know this was no ordinary call. The guest room is always ready for you. It's happened, hasn't it? It's finished, Brenda, I said. I'll leave the porch light on. Just come straight in, she said, without another question. That's why she's my best friend. She knows when to be quiet and just open the door. Thank you, I said, and hung up. I turned off the phone, removed the battery, and placed it on my nightstand. They would call frantically, but all they would hear is silence. One last thing to do. I picked up my suitcase and the leather briefcase and walked out of the room. I went down the stairs, my steps as light as a cat's. I walked through the living room, where my $4,800 sofa sat, silent and alien. I walked through the dining room, where the gleaming mahogany table waited for dinner parties to which I would never be invited. I stopped at the front door. My hand rested on the cold brass doorknob. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me to look back on. My home, my family, that was all in the past, in photo albums and in my memory. This place was just an empty shell. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. A light breeze stirred my hair. I pulled the door gently closed behind me. The click of the latch echoed in the silent night. In my coat pocket, I had a key. The key to this house. I considered leaving it under the doormat, one final courteous gesture. But no, the woman I used to be would have done that. Anne Harrison does not. I walked down the porch steps and out to the curb. I looked at the thick azalea bush next to the mailbox. Then, with a decisive flick of my wrist, I threw the house key deep into the foliage. I heard a faint rustle as it disappeared into the leaves. They wouldn't find it. They would have to call a locksmith. It would be the first in a long line of inconveniences that were about to rain down on them. I walked to the end of the block, to a corner far enough away to be out of sight of any neighbor's security cameras. I pulled out a disposable burner phone I'd bought last week. I called an Uber. 5 minutes later, a black Toyota Camry pulled up silently. The driver helped me put my suitcase in the trunk. "To the airport, ma'am?" he asked once I was settled inside. "No," I said, looking out the window one last time at the house, now just a dark shape against the night sky. "Take me to the Myers Park neighborhood." As the car pulled away, carrying me far from the 3 stolen years of my life, I didn't feel sadness or regret. All I felt was a cold, clean sense of release. They wouldn't be looking for a heartbroken old woman who had run away in tears. They would be looking for a ghost, and tomorrow morning, when the sun came up, that ghost would be coming back to reclaim what was hers, every single penny. The Uber glided through the night, carrying my silence through the deserted streets of Charlotte. Myers Park, the neighborhood where Brenda lived, was a world away from Ballantyne. Here, old brick houses sat nestled behind rows of ancient oak trees, carrying a quiet, timeless grace. It was like my old house, the one Richard and I had shared. It felt like home. True to her word, Brenda had left the porch light on. Its warm, yellow glow spilled out like a welcoming hug. I paid the driver, pulled my suitcase up the steps, and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. Brenda stood there in a silk robe, her silver hair in a neat bun. We didn't say a word. She just opened her arms and pulled me into a hug. In her warm, steady embrace, for the first time all night, I felt the icy shell around me threaten to crack, but I held it together. It wasn't time yet. "Come on in, Anne," she said softly. "I've made some chamomile tea." Brenda's living room smelled of old books and lemon polish. It was comfortably cluttered, with stacks of books on the coffee table and family photos covering the walls. We sat on the sofa, and she handed me a hot mug. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers. "Do you want to talk about it?" Brenda asked. I shook my head. "Not yet, but I need to ask you a favor. Tomorrow morning, no matter what happens, no matter who calls, even if it's Scott, just tell them you don't know where I am. Can you do that for me?" Brenda looked me straight in the eye. She saw the resolve there. "Of course, Anne. Anything." We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. This silence was different. It was the silence of friendship, of an understanding that needed no words. Finally, a wave of exhaustion hit me. "I think I should get some sleep," I said. Brenda led me up to the guest room on the second floor. It smelled of clean linens and lavender. The bed was already turned down. "You get some rest," she said. "Everything is going to be all right." I knew she was saying it to comfort me, but I also knew that before things got all right, they were going to get a whole lot worse. I lay down in the bed, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to worry about waking up at 5 in the morning. I closed my eyes, and in the quiet of my friend's house, for the first time in a very long time, I slept. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in Ballantyne, the drama was just beginning. 1 in the morning. Scott and Jessica's white BMW X5 glided into the garage. Trendy hip-hop music was still thumping from the speakers as they came in through the side door, both of them a little tipsy. Jessica leaned against Scott, giggling as she nearly tripped on the step. "Shh," Scott whispered, putting a finger to his lips. "Mom's asleep." They stepped into the house. It was dark and silent. "Why is it so dark in here?" Jessica grumbled, fumbling for the light switch. She always leaves the hall light on. The light from the crystal chandelier in the foyer flashed on, blindingly bright. The house was perfectly clean and eerily quiet. "Mom?" Scott called out, his voice a little hesitant. "Are you asleep?" Only silence answered him. A heavy silence, different from the usual peaceful quiet of the house. Jessica frowned, annoyance starting to cut through her buzz. She's probably sulking, all over a dinner party. Old people can be so dramatic. She kicked off her Christian Louboutin heels and padded into the kitchen for a bottle of water. A knot of unease tightened in Scott's stomach. He walked up the stairs. "Mom?" he called again, a little louder. The upstairs hallway was dark. He walked to my room. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and flipped on the light. And he froze. The room was unnaturally empty. The bed was made perfectly, not a single wrinkle. But on the nightstand, there was no half-read book, no reading glasses. The closet door was wide open, revealing nothing but empty hangers, hanging silently like little skeletons. "Jessica!" Scott yelled, a real note of panic in his voice. "Get up here, now!" Jessica trudged up the stairs, a bottle of Perrier in her hand. "What's all the racket?" She stopped in the doorway, her eyes taking in the room. "What the hell?" she muttered. Where did she move all her stuff? The truth began to sink in, cold and undeniable. His mother wasn't just sulking, his mother was gone. Scott bolted from the room, running to the kids' rooms. Olivia and Leo were sound asleep, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. He let out an unconscious sigh of relief, then the panic crashed back in. They met back in the living room. Their buzz had completely vanished, replaced by confusion and a dull, throbbing headache. "Call her," Jessica ordered. Scott's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He tapped on my contact, listed simply as Mom. He pressed the phone to his ear. After a long series of rings, the automated voice of the carrier came on. "The person you are calling is unavailable." "It's off," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Try it again." He did. Same result. Jessica snatched her own phone and called. Nothing. The initial flicker of worry, that tight feeling in the chest that his mother might be hurt somewhere, was quickly replaced by a more familiar, more selfish emotion. Pure frustration. "Damn it," Jessica swore, throwing her phone onto the sofa. "She left. This is just great. Who's going to take the kids to school tomorrow? I have a critical board meeting at 8 a.m. "I cannot be late." Scott stared at his wife, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. "Is that really the first thing you think of, Jessica? Not that Mom could have been in an accident or wondering where she is, but who's going to babysit for you so you can go to your meeting?" "Oh, give me a break, Scott," Jessica snapped, rolling her eyes. "She's 72, not 7. She can take care of herself. I'm sure she just ran off to her friend Brenda's house to complain. The point is, she left without a word and created this mess for us. She's your mother, so you need to take responsibility." "How is this my fault?" Scott shot back, his voice rising as his defenses kicked in. "You're the one who sent that damn text." "Heat up the leftovers." "Do you have any idea how that sounds? You treat her like she's the hired help." "I was just stating a fact," Jessica retorted, her voice becoming shrill. "She lives here for free, eats for free. The only thing she does is help around the house. It's a fair trade. And you never had the guts to say a word. You just stood there, silent like a coward, and let me be the bad guy." "I was quiet because I was trying to keep the peace," Scott roared. "I'm stuck in the middle, don't you get that? My wife on one side, my mother on the other. What was I supposed to do?" "Pick a side, Scott," she screamed in his face. "But forget it. Let's just deal with the problem at hand. Tomorrow, who's staying home?" They stood there, in their luxurious living room under the glittering crystal lights, two successful, grown adults, acting like selfish children. Their argument had no trace of genuine concern for the woman who had given birth to and raised one of them. It was all about the inconvenience. Whose schedule would have to be sacrificed? Who would be stuck cleaning up the mess? "You take the day off," Jessica said, crossing her arms. "She's your mother." "I can't," Scott protested. "I'm pushing to meet my numbers this month. You know that. You're the vice president now. You can miss one meeting." "Are you insane? This is my first meeting in my new role. I have to be there. Look, she probably just went to Brenda's. My guess is she'll come wandering back on her own tomorrow morning, feeling sorry for herself, and everything will go back to normal." That was the selfish hope they clung to, that I would come wandering back, full of regret, that this disruption was only temporary, that their comfortable world would soon be restored. The argument dragged on for another 30 minutes, accusations and blame flying back and forth like poisoned darts. Finally, exhausted and getting nowhere, they decided Scott would call his boss in the morning and ask to work from home for the first half of the day, hoping I'd be back before noon. They trudged upstairs, each retreating to their own side of the king-sized bed. Not another word was spoken between them. Silence fell on the house again. But this time it wasn't the silence of an empty home. It was the silence of a cracking marriage, of a family on the verge of collapse. As Scott lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, another, more frightening thought crept into his mind for the first time. Mom didn't take her phone. What did that mean? That wasn't the act of someone who was just angry for a night. That was the act of someone who wanted to cut off all contact, completely. A chill ran down Scott's spine. Maybe, just maybe, things weren't going to be back to normal in the morning. The sunrise in Myers Park brought with it the sound of birdsong and the fresh smell of dewy grass. I woke up at 7 o'clock, a luxury I hadn't had in 3 years. I had slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of a soldier before a decisive battle. Brenda had already left for work, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table next to a pot of hot coffee and a plate of homemade scones. "Make yourself at home, Anne. Stay strong. B." I sat by Brenda's kitchen window, sipping my coffee and looking out at her quiet garden. I didn't feel nervous or afraid. I just felt a sharp focus, the same way I used to feel when I was balancing the books at the end of the fiscal year. Every number had to add up, every step had to be precise. My plan was in motion. All I had to do now was wait. Back in Ballantyne, the morning was pure chaos. Scott woke up with a pounding headache and a heavy sense of dread in his chest. Jessica was already up, the sound of her hairdryer whining from the bathroom like a broken engine. He glanced toward my room. The door was still wide open, silent and ominous. His mother had not come back. When he walked downstairs, the scene was a miniature battlefield. Leo was crying because he couldn't find his favorite cereal. Olivia was struggling to braid her own hair, looking miserable. Jessica came down, her face a tight mask of stress. "Did you call your boss yet?" she asked curtly, trying to fasten a cufflink while simultaneously smearing butter on a piece of toast. "I was just about to," Scott mumbled. He felt a wave of resentment building. Why was he always the one who had to give in? "Where's Grandma?" Olivia asked, her voice small and worried. "She always helps me with my braids." "Grandma, had to leave early for something, sweetie," Scott lied, and the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Daddy will try to help." Scott's attempt at braiding hair was a catastrophe. Jessica burned the toast. Leo spilled an entire carton of milk on the floor. The house, which had always run so smoothly under my invisible hand, had descended into utter chaos. They were like actors suddenly shoved onto a stage without a script, without a prompter to feed them their lines. Finally, after a great deal of shouting and rushing, they managed to get the children into the car and off to school. They were late. "I'll have to work late tonight," Jessica said as Scott drove out of the neighborhood. "You'll have to pick up the kids and figure out dinner." "I have my own work to do, Jessica." "But it's your mother." The argument started all over again, a tiresome, looping track of blame. They didn't realize that their problem was no longer as simple as who was going to watch the children. Their real problems had only just begun. 9:15 in the morning, Jessica was sitting in her sleek, glass-walled office, trying to focus on the presentation for her 10 o'clock meeting. She'd already had 2 double espressos, but her head was still buzzing. She shot an irritated glance at the clock. Right now, she should have been calmly reviewing her slides, not worrying about what to feed the kids for dinner while trying to prepare for a meeting. And then, an email notification popped up on her computer screen. It was from an address she didn't recognize, admin@chenandassociates.com. The subject line was in all caps and bold, making it impossible to ignore. Urgent legal notification regarding Mrs. Ann Harrison. Jessica's heart started to pound. A cold dread crept up her spine. Her hand was trembling as she clicked the mouse to open it. The email was professional, cold, and utterly emotionless. "Dear Mrs. Jessica Harrison, please be advised that the law firm of Chen and Associates is the legal representative for our client, Mrs. Ann Harrison. At our client's request, we are initiating a formal investigation into allegations concerning financial exploitation of the elderly. This investigation pertains to a series of financial transactions between yourself and our client from the 15th of August 2022 to the present date. This includes, but is not limited to, unpaid personal loans, the unauthorized use of credit cards, and other actions constituting a breach of trust for financial gain. We hereby demand that you provide our office, within 10 business days, with complete copies of all bank statements, credit card statements, and any other financial records pertaining to your transactions with Mrs. Ann Harrison. Please note, a copy of this notification has also been forwarded to the Legal and Compliance Department of your employer for their information. Sincerely, Alex Chen, Esquio. Chen, Associates." Jessica read the email once, then a second time. The words swam before her eyes. Financial exploitation? Elderly abuse? These were terms she only heard in the bank's mandatory compliance training. They were career-destroying accusations for anyone in the financial industry. And then she read the last line again, forwarded to the Legal and Compliance Department of your employer. Jessica's world tilted on its axis. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. This wasn't an empty threat. This was a calculated, brutal attack. How could Anne, the simple old woman she'd always looked down on, possibly orchestrate something like this? Her office intercom buzzed. It was her boss's secretary. "Jessica, Mr. Thompson would like to see you in his office. Now." At the exact same time, back at the house in Ballantyne, Scott had just finished a difficult call with his own boss, arranging to work from home. He was sitting at the dining room table in front of his laptop, trying to focus on an Excel spreadsheet, but his mind kept drifting. He felt guilty, he felt angry, he felt helpless. The doorbell rang. Scott was surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone. He went to the door. A man in a courier uniform stood there, holding a tablet and a large white envelope. "Certified letter for Mr. Scott Harrison," the man said. "That's me," Scott replied. He signed the screen and took the envelope. It felt thick and important. He closed the door, tearing it open. Inside was a sheaf of papers printed on the official letterhead of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The first words hit him like a physical blow, written in bold and underlined. Eviction notice. Scott felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He had to sit down on the bottom step of the staircase to keep reading. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was painfully clear. Hereby requires Mr. Scott Harrison and Mrs. Jessica Harrison, current occupants of the property at 1245 Providence Road, Charlotte, NC2, 8277, to vacate and remove all personal property from the aforementioned premises within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Reason: unlawful occupancy of a property legally and solely owned by Mrs. Ann Harrison, per the Certificate of Title Number XXXXX, registered on the 10th of August 2022. The second blow had landed. It was even more powerful than the first. Losing money, his wife losing face at her company, that was one thing, but losing the house? The symbol of their success, the life they had worked to build? Scott sat there, in the cavernous living room, holding the paper like it was a death sentence. The house around him, with its neutral beige walls that Jessica had chosen, with the expensive sofa his mother had paid for, suddenly felt alien and hostile. This wasn't his house. It had never been his house. His phone rang. It was Jessica. He answered, and was met with the sound of his wife's hysterical, panicked sobbing. "Scott," she choked out. "It's over. Everything is over. She's ruined me." Scott couldn't find any words. All he could do was stare at the eviction notice in his hand. In her luxurious office overlooking Tryon Street in the heart of the city, Jessica felt like a defendant in the dock. Mr. Thompson, her boss, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive tailored suit, was looking at her over his gold-rimmed glasses with an unreadable expression. He wasn't angry. It was worse. He was disappointed. "Jessica," he began, his voice flat, "I just received a call from our legal department. They've been contacted by a law firm, Chen and Associates. The notice they received contains some very serious allegations. Mr. Thompson, it's all a misunderstanding," Jessica said quickly, her voice trembling. It's a family matter. My mother-in-law, she's getting older and perhaps she's not thinking clearly." It was a desperate, double-edged lie. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Ann Harrison, a retired bookkeeper, age 72, is perfectly lucid," he said, and Jessica felt her stomach clench. "Our legal team has already done a preliminary check. The law firm is very reputable, and Jessica, in our industry, there is no such thing as a misunderstanding when it comes to the financial exploitation of the elderly. You know that." He steepled his fingers on the polished mahogany desk. "This bank is built on trust. Our clients trust us with their life savings. How can they possibly trust a vice president who is being accused by her own mother of financial exploitation?" Every excuse Jessica had prepared died in her throat. She knew he was right. In her world of numbers and regulations, reputation was everything, and she had just thrown hers into a bonfire. What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. "Effective immediately, you are on paid administrative leave, pending the results of our internal investigation," Mr. Thompson said, his voice void of all emotion. "I strongly suggest you resolve this family matter quickly and completely. Please leave your company laptop and ID badge with HR on your way out. Administrative leave." The words hit Jessica like a sentence. The vice president title she had just earned, her pride and symbol of success, had been stripped away from her in the space of a single morning. As she walked out of Mr. Thompson's office, she could feel dozens of eyes on her. The whispers started behind her back, like the hissing of snakes. The web of prestige she had so carefully woven over the years had just been torn to shreds. She ran into the women's restroom, locked herself in a stall, and was violently sick into the toilet. And then she called Scott. While Jessica was facing the collapse of her career, Scott was facing the collapse of his conscience. After his wife's frantic phone call, he remained frozen on the stairs, the eviction notice crumpled in his hand. And then, the realization began to dawn on him. The truth wasn't just in the cold, legal text on the paper. The truth was in his own 3 years of silence. He remembered the day they had convinced his mother to sell her house. He'd actually believed his own words then. "We'll be one big, happy family." He had painted a beautiful picture of cozy evenings together, of his mother reading stories to the grandchildren, of them taking care of her in her old age. It was a promise, a sacred promise. But what had they done? The memories came flooding back, piece by piece, each one like a knife to the heart. He remembered the times Jessica had complained about the way his mother seasoned the food. He had said nothing. He remembered the times Jessica had bought expensive things on the joint credit card, when in fact his mother was paying the lion's share of the bill. He had looked the other way. He remembered the evenings when his mother ate alone in the kitchen, while the rest of them watched a movie in the family room. He had told himself, "Mom likes the quiet." And he remembered the times his mother had tried to talk to him, starting with, "Scott, honey, there's something I need to talk to you about." But he had always cut her off. "Later, Mom. I'm busy right now." He hadn't been busy. He'd been hiding. He was afraid to confront Jessica. He was afraid to admit that his perfect family had a massive crack running right through the middle of it, and it was getting wider every day. His silence hadn't been about keeping the peace. It had been about cowardice. And now, the bill for that cowardice had come due. They had destroyed everything. His mother's unconditional love, the dream house she had handed them the keys to, their finances, their reputations, and most importantly, their family. It had all gone up in smoke. He stood up, his feet as heavy as lead. He walked into his home office and opened a desk drawer. At the bottom was an old box. He opened it. Inside were old photographs. One of him as a 7-year-old boy, sitting on his father's shoulders on a fishing trip, his mother standing beside them, beaming. Another of the whole family in their old house on his 16th birthday, his mother carrying out a homemade cake. In all of those pictures, his mother was there, the center of their warmth, the foundation of their family, and he had allowed that woman to be treated like a stranger in the very home she had bought for him. Tears began to trace paths down Scott's cheeks, not tears of fear, but tears of profound, soul-crushing regret. He had failed, as a son. And then, the final, most devastating truth revealed itself. Attached to the eviction notice was a copy of the deed to the house. Scott had only glanced at it before, but now, in the quiet of his anguish, he read every single word. He saw his mother's name, Ann Harrison, and then he saw the details of the transaction. Down payment, $90,000, paid in full by Ann Harrison. Mortgage loan, $410,000. Sole borrower and responsible party, Ann Harrison. Scott's head swam. He had always assumed they had just put his mother's name on the deed as a formality, and that the mortgage was in his and Jessica's names. Every month, he transferred a set amount into their joint account for the payment, and he just assumed Jessica was doing the same. But no, the loan was entirely in his mother's name, which meant that for the past 3 years they hadn't been paying the mortgage on their house. In the eyes of the law, they had simply been contributing to the rent for their landlord, the same landlord they treated like a maid. The truth was so monstrous, so humiliating, it stripped away every last one of his illusions. They hadn't just been living off his mother's money. They had been living entirely on her property, in her house, under her legal and financial protection. Scott's regret morphed into a sickening self-loathing. How could he have been so blind, so thoughtless? And then, a thought struck him. He lunged for his computer and logged into his and Jessica's joint bank account. He looked at the transaction history. Just as he thought, his monthly transfer was there. But when he checked the outgoing payments, another truth emerged. The monthly mortgage payment to the bank was significantly larger than the amount he and Jessica put in combined. Where was the rest of the money coming from? With trembling hands, he opened another tab and logged into the old savings account his mother had opened for him in college, the one she still occasionally deposited money into for the grandkids. He searched, and he found it. Every single month, like clockwork, a transfer was made from his mother's retirement account to the mortgage account. It wasn't a small amount. She hadn't just given them the down payment. She had been quietly covering a huge chunk of the monthly mortgage payments out of her own meager pension for 3 years. Scott dropped his head onto the keyboard, and for the first time since his father died, he wept. He wept like a child, for his own stupidity, for his mother's silent sacrifice, and for the family he had single-handedly destroyed. For the rest of that day, the house in Ballantyne was shrouded in a heavy silence, more suffocating than any that had come before. It wasn't the emptiness of me being at the grocery store or the park with the children. It was the silence of a tomb, where all hope and illusion had been laid to rest. Scott sat in his office, not eating, not drinking, just staring at the old photos and the brutal numbers on his computer screen. Every number was an accusation, every photo a reminder of the son he used to be and the man he had failed to become. Jessica came home in the afternoon, not with the swagger of a powerful vice president, but like a defeated soldier. She'd had to walk the hall of shame at the bank, packing her personal belongings into a cardboard box under the curious stares and venomous whispers of her colleagues. The red power dress she had worn the night before now looked garish and crumpled on a chair in her bedroom. The world she had worked so hard to build, a world based on status and appearances, had crumbled in a matter of hours. They didn't speak to each other. There was nothing left to say, no one left to blame. They were each trapped in their own private hell, tortured by the what-ifs. What if she hadn't sent the text? What if he had spoken up? But it was too late for what-ifs. The next morning, Scott called me. This time, I answered. I was sitting in Brenda's kitchen, calmly sipping my tea. I was ready for this call. "Mom." His voice on the other end of the line was raw and broken. There was a long pause, and I could hear him trying to choke back a sob. I said nothing. I let the silence do its work. "Where are you?" he finally managed to ask. "Are you okay?" That question, a simple question about my well-being, had come 3 years too late. "I'm fine, Scott," I replied, my voice cool and distant, the voice of a stranger, not his mother. "Mom, we got the papers," he said, his voice a near whisper. "Mom, can we please talk? Please, please come home." "There is no home to come back to, Scott," I said. "It is my house, and I don't want to come back." Then what are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice full of desperation. "The law offices of Alex Chen," I said, enunciating every word. 101 Tryon Street, 15th floor, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Both of you. Don't be late. And then I hung up. I didn't give him the chance to beg or explain. The stage for our confrontation had been moved from the House of Lies to the Office of Justice. At 10 o'clock the next morning, I was at Alex's office. I wore a simple but elegant gray suit, my silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. I was not the frumpy, apron-wearing old woman they were used to. I was Mrs. Ann Harrison, the client. Alex, sharp and brilliant, had everything prepared. The conference room had a panoramic view of the city, but the blinds were half drawn, creating a formal, slightly oppressive atmosphere. On the long, polished table sat only a pitcher of water, some glasses, and a laptop. At 10 o'clock sharp, Scott and Jessica walked in. They looked pathetic. Scott was gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He wore an old suit that seemed too big for his shrunken frame. Jessica was the opposite. She had tried to use makeup to hide her exhaustion, but the thick foundation only accentuated her puffy eyes and pale skin. She wore a high-collared black dress, as if she were attending a funeral, which I suppose she was, the funeral for her own life. They sat on the opposite side of the table, as far away from me as possible. Alex began, his voice professional and cold. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. We're here today to discuss the matters outlined in the legal notices you received. My client, Mrs. Ann Harrison, has authorized me." "Mom!" Jessica suddenly interrupted, her desperation shattering her fake composure. She looked directly at me, her eyes welling with tears. "How could you do this to us? To your own family? You've destroyed everything. My career, our home." I didn't respond. I just looked at her, my expression calm and unreadable. Then, I gave a slight nod to Alex. It was the signal. Alex turned his laptop to face them. He clicked the mouse. On the large screen mounted on the wall, an Excel spreadsheet appeared. It was the same one Scott had seen, but now presented professionally, with the law firm's logo. Line by line, column by column, it detailed with brutal precision every dollar Jessica had borrowed, every designer item she had purchased on my card. The total debt, $52,450, was highlighted in bold red at the bottom. Jessica fell silent. Her face went white as a sheet. Alex clicked again. The screen changed to a series of credit card statements with the extravagant purchases circled in red. A Prada handbag, a weekend spa getaway she had told me was a company trip. "Mrs. Harrison," Alex said, his voice even, "do you recognize these transactions?" Jessica couldn't speak. She could only give a weak, defeated nod. And then, Alex delivered the final blow. He opened an audio file. A familiar voice filled the conference room, Jessica's voice, shrill and self-satisfied. "That old woman? Having her here is like having a free maid. Cooks, cleans, babysits. And it doesn't cost a dime." The sound of her and her friend's laughter echoed in the silent room, jarring and grotesque. Alex stopped the audio file. He took out his phone, pulled up a photo, and slid it across the table toward them. It was a screenshot of the final text message. "Anne, remember to heat up the leftover prime rib in the fridge for your lunch tomorrow. Don't let it go to waste." All the evidence was on the table, undeniable, indefensible. Scott, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. He wasn't looking at Jessica. He was looking at me, and in his eyes, I saw a man who was completely broken. "Why, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine, painful question. Why did it have to come to this? Finally, I spoke directly to him. I looked deep into the eyes of my son, the man I had loved more than anything in this world. "Because of your silence, Scott," I said, my voice no longer cold, but filled with a bottomless sorrow. "For 3 years you chose to be silent." I was just trying to keep the peace," he stammered. "No, Scott," I interrupted. "You confused peace with avoidance. You thought silence would create a space where things would just work themselves out. You thought it was a passive, harmless solution. But you were wrong. Silence is never harmless." I took a deep breath. "Your silence became a form of permission. It gave Jessica permission to believe her behavior was acceptable. It gave disrespect permission to sprout and grow into contempt. It gave your mother permission to slowly disappear, right before your very eyes. Your silence wasn't a space for peace, Scott. It was fertile ground for rot. It allowed other things to fester. It blurred the lines between right and wrong, and in the end, it brought everything crashing down." The room was utterly still. My words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Scott dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Jessica, for the first time, had no look of arrogance or desperation. She just looked small and pitiful. Alex cleared his throat, bringing the meeting back to legal matters. "Based on this evidence, my client has ample grounds to proceed with a civil suit for damages, as well as file a criminal complaint for financial abuse of the elderly. However," he paused, glancing at me. "However, I'm not going to do that," I continued. "I will not send the father of my grandchildren to jail, but I will not continue to live in a lie either." I looked at them. "You will vacate my house within 30 days, as the notice states. The house will be sold. After deducting the $52,450 Jessica owes me, and the entirety of my $90,000 down payment, what remains of the home's value, after all expenses, I will give to you, Scott. Consider it the last of the inheritance your father and I are giving you to start over. As for Jessica's career," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "I will have my lawyer send a letter to the bank, stating that the family matter has been resolved internally and that I will not be pursuing legal action. What they decide to do with you is their business. I've given you a chance. Don't waste it." Everything had been said. The judgment had been delivered. Scott and Jessica didn't say another word. They just nodded. They stood, and without looking at me, they quietly left the conference room, like two ghosts leaving their own sentencing. When the door closed behind them, I finally allowed myself to exhale, a long, slow breath. The war was over. I had won. But in my heart, there was no joy of victory. Only the hollow emptiness of a battle that should never have been fought. When that conference room door closed, leaving Alex and me in the quiet, I felt an invisible weight I'd been carrying for 3 years finally lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the happy feeling of a win. It was more like how a patient feels after major surgery, sore, exhausted, but knowing the tumor has been removed. "You did very well, Mrs. Harrison," Alex said, his professional voice now warmed with a hint of kindness. "You were very strong." "I just did what had to be done, Alex," I replied, gazing out the window at the bustling city of Charlotte, completely unaware of the small tragedy that had just played out in one of its high-rise towers. "What now?" "Now, we handle the formalities," Alex explained. "We'll draft the settlement agreements, oversee their moving out, and work with a realtor to sell the house in Ballantyne. You don't have to worry about a thing. Just rest and start the next chapter of your life." The next chapter. It sounded so strange. For years, my life had been defined by my role as a wife, then a mother, and finally, a grandmother/housekeeper. Who was Anne Harrison without those titles? I would have to find out. The next 30 days were a whirlwind. For me, they were days of peace. I stayed with Brenda, helping her in the garden, reading books I'd missed, and taking long walks in the park every afternoon. For the first time in years, I had time to listen to myself, to feel the sun on my skin, to take a full breath. I started writing again, not in a ledger, but in a journal. I wrote about Richard, about Scott as a boy, about my hopes and my disappointments. Writing helped me piece my own spirit back together. But for Scott and Jessica, it was 30 days of hell on earth. They had to face the harsh reality of finding a new place to live on a shoestring budget and a tight deadline. Jessica's reputation at the bank, though she wasn't criminally charged, was in tatters. They didn't fire her, but her promotion to vice president was rescinded. She was moved to a less important department, a silent demotion. The gossip was rampant, and she had to work every day in an environment filled with judgmental stares and whispers. Her pride was gone, replaced by humiliation. Scott had to shoulder most of the burden. He scrambled to find an apartment, packed up their belongings, and most importantly, he had to explain things to the children. I can only imagine that conversation. How do you explain to a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old that they have to leave the only home they've ever known, that their comfortable life is over, and that it's all their parents' fault? Brenda told me she ran into Scott at the grocery store. He looked gaunt, like he'd aged 10 years. He tried to avoid her, but she walked right up to him. All he could manage to mumble was, "I was wrong, Aunt Brenda. I was so terribly wrong." The move itself was a painful ordeal. They had to do it all themselves. The luxurious furniture Jessica had so proudly selected looked pathetic, piled high in cardboard boxes. They had to sell most of it. The new apartment they found was a third of the size of the house. It was a clean but unremarkable 2-bedroom unit on the other side of town. It was a clear step down, a daily reminder of all they had lost. On the last day, as the moving truck pulled away, leaving the house in Ballantyne empty and cold, Jessica reportedly just sat down on the front steps and cried. Not the angry, self-pitying tears from the lawyer's office. This time, she cried for what was lost, for the family she had helped destroy. Scott just stood there, silently placing a hand on her shoulder. There were no words of comfort that could possibly help. After they left, I went back to the house one last time, with Alex and a real estate agent. Walking through the door, I felt a stunning sense of detachment. The scent of my family, my baking, Jessica's perfume, the kids' crayons was gone. All that was left was the smell of fresh paint and empty air. The beige walls now showed faint outlines where family photos once hung. The house felt huge and soulless. I walked from room to room, memories flooding back. The spot in the kitchen where I stood for thousands of hours, the living room where I sat in silence while they watched movies, the staircase where I'd overheard their arguments. This place didn't hold happy memories. It was a museum of quiet suffering. "Is there anything you'd like to keep, Mrs. Harrison?" the agent asked. I looked around. Everything was expensive, perfect, but none of it was mine. "No," I said. "Sell it with the house." The house sold quickly. The market in Charlotte was hot. Once all the paperwork was finalized, Alex transferred the money into my account. The number was large, but it brought me no joy. It was simply the end of a sad chapter. True to my word, I had Alex set aside a portion for Scott after my down payment, and the debts were deducted. It was a substantial amount, enough for a new start, but not enough to return to their old life of luxury. The first thing I did with my money wasn't to shop or travel. I went to see a financial advisor, a smart, kind woman Brenda recommended. "I want to do something for my grandchildren," I told her. "I want to make sure that no matter what happens with their parents, their education is secure." Together, we worked it out. 2 weeks later, the Harrison Education Trust for Olivia and Leo was established. A professionally managed trust of $150,000, which would pay for their college educations when the time came. That was my legacy. My love for them turned into something tangible, something no adult squabble could ever take away. With the rest of the money, I did something for myself. I bought a small condo, not in Ballantyne or Myers Park. It was in the Noda Arts District, a vibrant neighborhood with small galleries, quirky coffee shops, and colorful murals on the walls. My place only has 1 bedroom, but it has a large balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. It's mine, completely mine. I decorated it myself. I bought old furniture and repainted it. I hung pictures of Richard, of Scott as a little boy, and of Olivia and Leo. I filled the bookshelves with books I loved. For the first time in years, I bought a fine bone china tea set, just because I liked it. My new life began. A simple life, but a full one. I joined a book club at the local library. I started volunteering, teaching a knitting class at a community center. I made friends with my neighbors, artists, writers, people who lived lives that weren't obsessed with status or things. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's dream. I was living my own life. Meanwhile, I knew Scott and Jessica were starting over too. Their life was now a daily struggle. Jessica, after a few months of working in the cold, hostile environment, quit the bank. She couldn't take it anymore. She got a job as a sales associate at a department store, a job that required a humility she'd never known. Scott had to take a second job on weekends, driving for a delivery service to make up for the lost income. They had to learn how to budget, how to cook at home instead of eating out, how to find joy in simple things. That hardship, I hoped, would be a healing medicine. It forced them to rely on each other in a whole new way, not for comfort, but for survival. It forced them to face themselves, with no shield of wealth and success to hide behind. I knew they were struggling, but I also know that it's only when you hit the bottom that you can find the strength to push yourself back up. And from a distance, I was quietly hoping they would find that strength. Not for me, but for Olivia and Leo, for their future. Time has a funny way of healing. It doesn't erase the scars, but it softens them, turning painful memories into quiet lessons. 2 years passed since the day I walked out of that house in Ballantyne. 2 years of silence, not a punishing silence, but a necessary one, to give us all room to breathe, to reflect, and to begin again. My life in Noda was settled. My little condo had become a true home, filled with light and the laughter of new friends. I had found Anne again, the woman who had been buried under layers of roles and responsibilities. I was no longer living for other people. I was living with them. It's a big difference. I still kept up with news of Scott and Jessica, not through calls or visits, but through occasional updates from Brenda, who still knew some old mutual friends. I knew they had gone through an incredibly difficult time. They had to sell the BMW X5 and get an old Honda. Jessica struggled with her retail job, where her smile was no longer a weapon of power but a requirement of the job. Scott worked constantly, shouldering the financial responsibility with a belated sense of maturity. I heard they fought a lot that first year. The financial stress and the sudden change in lifestyle wore them down. There were times I thought they might break up, but they didn't. Somehow, perhaps because they had nothing left to lose, they clung to each other. They had to learn how to communicate, how to cooperate, how to be a real team. And then, one Sunday morning in the fall, 2 years after that fateful day, my phone rang. The screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in a very long time. Scott. My heart skipped a beat. I took a deep breath and answered, "Hello?" Ending the president. "Hello? Mom." The voice on the other end wasn't that of a panicked man or a desperate child. It was Scott, my son, but there was a quiet humility in his tone I'd never heard before. "I'm sorry to bother you." "It's no bother, Scott," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "What is it?" There was a pause. I could hear him take a breath. "Mom, Olivia and Leo, they miss you. They ask about you all the time. I was wondering, if maybe we could bring them by to see you for a little while? That offer, so simple and direct, melted the last bit of ice around my heart. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for anything for himself. He was thinking of his children. Of course, I said, and I was surprised to hear a little tremor in my own voice. I miss them too. That first meeting, at my new apartment, was awkward. Scott and Jessica brought the kids but hovered in the doorway, as if they didn't dare to step inside. Olivia and Leo were different. The moment they saw me, they launched themselves into my arms. "Grandma!" Leo yelled, burying his head in my stomach. "I missed you!" "I missed you too, my little angel," I said, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair. Olivia, now a budding 12-year-old, just hugged me tightly, silently. I could feel her trembling. I invited them in. Scott and Jessica entered timidly, looking around my small but cozy apartment with a kind of wonder. It was a world away from the huge, sterile house they used to live in. That visit only lasted an hour. We made small talk about the kids' school, about the weather. Scott and Jessica barely said a word, just watched me play with the grandkids. But as they were leaving, Jessica turned and said, her voice barely a whisper, "Thank you for letting us come." It was a start. The visits became more regular after that, every couple of weeks. Slowly, the awkwardness began to fade. Scott started staying for a cup of tea after Jessica took the kids to a nearby park. We started to talk again, not about the painful past, but about ordinary things. About his new job at a small construction company. About the struggles and the small joys of their new life. I learned that Jessica was changing too. She'd found another job, as an administrative assistant at a doctor's office. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and she was good at it. She was no longer obsessed with designer labels or fancy vacations. She was learning to find joy in baking cookies with the kids on a weekend, or going to the local movie theater. On my 75th birthday, something unexpected happened. They threw me a small party at their apartment. The place was small, but it was decorated warmly. Jessica had baked a carrot cake from scratch, my favorite. It wasn't as perfect as one from a bakery, but it was the best cake I'd ever tasted. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jessica came and sat next to me. "Anne," she began, twisting a napkin in her hands, "I know an apology is not enough, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I am truly, truly sorry. You gave me a lesson, a painful but necessary one. You taught me the value of family, of humility, and of gratitude. Thank you." Tears rolled down her cheeks, and this time, I didn't see a domineering, selfish woman. I saw a daughter-in-law, a wife, a mother, who had found her way back after being lost. I put my hand on hers. "I forgive you, Jessica." And just like that, piece by piece, our family began to heal. It wasn't the same as before. The scar was still there, a permanent reminder of what happened. But around that scar, new skin had grown, stronger and more resilient. The final scene of this story isn't some grand party or a lavish vacation. It takes place on a normal Sunday afternoon in a public park. I was sitting on a park bench, watching Olivia and Leo on the swings. Scott and Jessica were next to me, not with an awkward distance between them, but sitting close, their shoulders touching. We were all eating ice cream cones. "Grandma, look at me!" Leo shouted from the top of the slide. "I see you. You're doing great." I laughed, waving back at him. Scott turned to me, a peace in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly, "for not giving up on us." "Family is about never giving up, Scott," I replied. Jessica smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "You're right. Our old family fell apart, but maybe it had to fall apart so we could build a new one, a better one." We sat there, 3 generations, under the golden afternoon Sunday. We didn't have a big house, or fancy cars, or high-powered titles, but we had each other. We had found our way back, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. Happiness, I realized, isn't the absence of storms. It's the ability to find the calm in the eye of the hurricane, even when the winds are still howling in the distance. And on that day, in that park, we found our calm. So you see, my story has a happy ending. But happy endings don't always look like they do in the fairy tales. It isn't about everything going back to the way it was. In fact, the best thing that ever happened was that things didn't go back to the way they were. I learned an important lesson. Silence is not golden. Sometimes it's poison. It quietly kills love, it kills respect, and in the end, it kills your own spirit. Your voice, no matter how small or shaky it might feel, is the most powerful tool you have. Use it. I also learned that forgiveness is a two-way street. You can't truly forgive others if you haven't first learned to protect yourself. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's self-respect. And walking away isn't always a failure. Sometimes, it's the bravest thing you can do to give both yourself and the people you love a chance to heal. My family isn't perfect now. We still have hard days. The sad memories still surface from time to time. But now, we have honesty, we have respect. And we have a love that is built on the solid foundation of truth, not on the shifting sands of pretense. So to all you wonderful women out there who have seen your share of life's ups and downs, is there something in your story that needs to be said? Is there a boundary that needs to be drawn? And do you believe that even after the most ferocious storm, it's possible to find that calm in the center? Think about it. And remember, it is never, ever too late to write the final chapter of your own story.